Lucas didn't care who walked through the door anymore. A year ago, maybe. Back when he still thought this job meant something, when he still tried to impress the high-rolling customers who flooded Brixton Prime every night with their oversized egos and bottomless bank accounts. But not anymore. These days, he was just trying to survive, clock in, clock out, and make enough to keep the lights on at home. His mother's medical bills were stacking up. His sister's tuition was overdue. And the last thing he needed tonight was another entitled rich guy snapping his fingers for a refill. But of course, life had other plans. The door swung open, and in walked a guy who didn't fit. Hoodie, old jeans, sneakers that had seen better days. The kind of person who would have been turned away at the door if the right people had noticed. But Lisa, the hostess, barely looked up from her reservation book. She was used to sizing people up in 2 seconds flat. Who mattered, who didn't. This guy? He didn't. Table for one, the man said, voice low, rough around the edges. Lisa didn't even bother with the fake warmth she reserved for regulars and celebrities. Sure, she said, flipping a page, barely looking at him. You have a reservation? No. She exhaled through her nose, tapped her pen against the podium. She didn't say. Are you sure you can afford this place? But Lucas could hear it anyway. He smirked to himself as he grabbed a menu. Follow me, Lisa muttered, leading the guy toward the back. Not prime seating, but hey, he hadn't asked for the good spots. Lucas had seen it before. A guy walks in, thinking he's about to impress someone. A date, a business partner, maybe just himself. Orders the cheapest thing on the menu, acts like he belongs, leaves a terrible tip. He braced himself for another one of those nights. The guy settled into his seat. No phone flashing under the table. No glancing around to see who was watching. Just silence. Lucas had been here long enough to know the types. The Wall Street execs who threw around $1,000 tips like confetti. The influencers who took 50 pictures of their drink before taking a sip. The actors who thought being in one Netflix movie meant they deserved a free meal. Then there were the wannabes. Guys like this one, who showed up in expensive places dressed like they didn't care. The kind of guys who either had more money than they knew what to do with, or none at all. Either way, Lucas didn't have the energy to pretend to care. He grabbed a notepad and walked over, professional smile barely hanging on. Welcome to Brixton Prime. Can I start you off with something to drink? The guy looked up from the menu, eyes sharp. Whiskey, neat. Whatever you got. Lucas arched a brow. Oh, this is going to be good. This wasn't a whiskey bar. This was a place where people ordered wines with names they couldn't pronounce and acted like they understood the difference. Whiskey drinkers? They belonged at the hole-in-the-wall spots downtown, not here. Still, he nodded, grabbed the menu, and walked off. Back at the bar, he slid the order over to Marco, the bartender, who took one look at it and snorted. Whiskey? Here? Lucas shrugged. Some guys just don't get it. Marco poured. Lucas grabbed the glass. And as he walked back, he caught snippets of a conversation at a nearby table. A hedge fund guy explaining to his date why he deserved his 6-figure bonus. A group of executives talking about their next big project. The usual. He reached the table and set the whiskey down, not bothering with the usual care he gave to high rollers. Ready to order? The guy flipped the menu shut. What do you recommend? Lucas resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Classic. The kind of question people asked when they wanted to act like they knew what they were doing. Everything's good, he said, voice flat. But if you're looking for something easy, the soup of the day is accessible. The guy paused. Accessible? Lucas tapped his pen against the notepad. Yeah, $15. The lobster's market price, significantly higher today. He expected hesitation, a quick glance at the price, maybe a nervous laugh. Instead, the guy didn't blink. I'll have the foie gras to start. He pronounced it wrong, like every other guy trying too hard. Lucas clenched his jaw. And for your main? The filet, medium rare. Of course. Lucas clicked his pen, barely keeping the smirk off his face. You sure? Foie gras is sophisticated, not for everyone's palate. A couple at the next table exchanged glances. The air shifted just slightly. They weren't the only ones listening. The guy nodded, unbothered. I'm sure. Lucas wasn't done. And a bottle of wine? The guy still didn't look at the menu. Chateau Lafite Rothschild, 2010. Lucas nearly laughed. Either this guy had no clue what he'd just ordered, or he was the best actor in the room. That bottle alone cost more than Lucas made in a month. He snorted. That one's 2,500 a bottle. Maybe you'd prefer. The bottle will be fine. Lucas shut his mouth. Fine. Whatever. He'd seen it before. Guys trying to impress a date, running up a bill, and then pretending their credit card was acting up. He'd be surprised if this guy even made it to dessert before getting embarrassed. As he walked back toward the bar, he shook his head. Bet you $20 his card gets declined. Marco muttered as he prepped a martini for another table. Lucas smirked. You're on. Across the room, the guy sat back in his chair, quietly watching the restaurant move around him. The murmurs, the whispers, the quiet amusement. He'd seen it all before, and he didn't care. Lucas had dealt with his fair share of difficult customers. Arrogant, clueless, entitled, broke but pretending they weren't. This guy? He was something different. He didn't have the usual tells. No nervous tapping, no side eyes at the price list, no overcompensating energy. He just sat there, calm as anything, like he already knew exactly how this was going to play out. Which was fine. Lucas had seen plenty of guys come in with that kind of fake confidence, only to crash and burn when the check arrived. He dropped the wine bottle off at the table, watching, waiting. Any second now, the guy was going to do something stupid, fumble with the cork, ask for a different vintage, maybe even pretend he ordered the wrong bottle. But no. He just nodded, let Lucas handle the pour, and took a sip without making a show of it. Lucas wasn't sure why that annoyed him so much. Back at the bar, Marco leaned in. So? Did he freak out? Lucas shook his head. Not yet, but it's coming. Marco smirked. Gotta love a slow burn. Lucas glanced back at table 22. The guy was watching the room, like he was absorbing everything. Not just the food, the service, the wine, everything. He caught snippets of conversations around him. A producer 2 tables over bragging about a deal he just closed. A hedge fund manager explaining in painstaking detail why he deserved a tax break. An influencer loudly dissecting the flavors in her cocktail like she was auditioning for a food critic gig. The usual crowd. Lucas had been around these people long enough to know what they thought of guys like him. He was part of the background. They snapped their fingers when they needed something, ignored him when they didn't, and left him a 5% tip while posting about supporting the working class on Twitter. The guy at table 22, though, he wasn't acting like them. He wasn't acting like anything, really, and that was starting to get under Lucas's skin. When the food arrived, Lucas watched closely. This was when the facade usually cracked. Guys who didn't belong in places like this always gave themselves away eventually. Maybe they mispronounced foie gras. Maybe they drowned a $100 steak in steak sauce. Maybe they picked up the wrong fork and then overcorrected so hard they looked ridiculous. Table 22 didn't flinch. He cut into the steak, ate, sipped his wine, and just kept watching. Not in a paranoid way. Not in a who's looking at me kind of way. More like someone who had been on the other side of this scene 1,000 times before and knew exactly how it worked. Lucas had spent years perfecting the art of the well-timed insult, the backhanded compliment, the kind of polite condescension that only those paying attention would catch. He'd used it on influencers who thought having 1 million followers meant they deserved special treatment, on actors who had one good role and decided they were royalty, on trust fund kids who had never worked a real job but still complained about stress. This guy wasn't biting. He took every comment, every subtle dig, and let them slide right past him, like none of it mattered. Then he asked for ketchup. Lucas almost laughed. He didn't have to say anything. The producer at the next table coughed into his napkin to stifle a chuckle. A woman in a designer dress exchanged a knowing look with her husband. The whole room shifted just slightly, the way it always did when someone made it clear they didn't belong. Lucas kept his expression neutral, but inside he was practically giddy. You want ketchup? Table 22 nodded, not reacting to the shift in atmosphere. Yeah. Lucas let out a breath. For the steak. Yeah. A pause. I'll see what I can do, Lucas said, dragging out the words just enough for anyone paying attention to hear the unspoken verism. Are you serious? Behind them. Back at the bar, Marco leaned in. Please tell me he didn't. Lucas grinned. Oh, he did. Marco shook his head, reaching for a bottle. Man just ordered a $2,500 wine and asked for ketchup with his steak? Lucas shrugged. Some people really can't be saved. He went back to the kitchen, where the staff had already started placing bets. Sophia, one of the servers, was nearly doubled over laughing. You knew the second he walked in, didn't you? She wheezed. Lucas smirked. It's a gift. Someone in the back whistled. Man's about to get humbled hard. By the time Lucas made it back to the table, the energy in the room had shifted. Conversations had quieted. People were paying attention, but in that discreet, not looking directly at the car crash kind of way. Lucas set the bottle of ketchup on the table with an exaggerated amount of care, like he was handling something delicate. Enjoy, he said, waiting. And then, nothing. No hesitation. No embarrassment. The guy just poured a little onto the side of his plate and kept eating like nothing was wrong. Lucas felt something shift, just slightly. He had been so sure of how this would play out. He knew these kinds of guys. He had seen this exact situation 100 times before. But something wasn't lining up. Most people, most wannabes, would have tried to backtrack by now. They would have noticed the way the room had turned against them. They would have laughed it off, changed their order, something. Table 22 didn't care. If anything, he looked amused. Not surprised, not uncomfortable, just quietly entertained, like he was watching everyone else play a game he had no interest in. Lucas wasn't sure why that bothered him so much. He went back to the bar, not saying anything, but Marco must have seen something on his face. What? Lucas shook his head. I don't know. Dude's an idiot, right? Yeah. A pause. But I don't know. Marco frowned. What do you mean? You don't know? Lucas looked back at table 22, watching the man sip his wine like he wasn't the center of a rapidly growing spectacle. Something was off. Lucas had walked into this night thinking he had it all figured out. Now he wasn't so sure. Lucas had been working at Brixton Prime long enough to predict how nights like this would end. Some guy walks in, tries too hard, racks up a ridiculous bill, and then, when it's time to pay, stalls. Maybe he pats his pockets, pretends he left his wallet in the car. Maybe he plays it cool, asks if the restaurant takes crypto, acts surprised when they don't. The worst ones just go straight to the "this has never happened before" routine. Like that's supposed to make the embarrassment go away. Lucas had seen all of it. And that's why he wasn't even trying to hide his amusement as he walked toward table 22 with the check. $3,478.50. He set the bill down like he was dropping a hammer. This was the moment, the second of hesitation. The flicker of panic, the excuse forming behind their eyes before they even opened their mouths. But table 22 didn't hesitate. The man barely glanced at the bill before pulling out his wallet and sliding a card across the table. Not just any card, a black one. The kind that didn't have a spending limit. The kind only a handful of people in the world carried. For the first time that night, Lucas froze. The restaurant had been watching this whole thing unfold, pretending not to but failing miserably. Conversations quieted. A few heads turned. Someone at the executive table whispered, and a phone screen lit up, discreetly recording. Lucas had been so sure, so absolutely certain that he had this guy figured out. That he was another wannabe, another fake, another guy playing dress-up in a world he didn't belong to. And then he saw Lisa at the hostess stand, one hand clamped over her mouth. Marco dropped a bottle behind the bar. Sophia whispered something under her breath, eyes wide. Lucas had never seen her look like that. Then the words hit him. That's Snoop Dogg. Everything stopped. The second it registered, Lucas's mind started replaying the entire night in fast forward. Every snide remark, every sarcastic comment, every time he had gone out of his way to make the guy feel like he didn't belong. And Snoop Dogg, had let him do it. The amusement, the quiet confidence, the complete lack of reaction. Not because he was clueless, not because he was pretending, but because none of it had mattered to him. Lucas had been taking shots at someone who'd been bulletproof since the 90s. He had spent the last 2 hours treating a global icon like some clueless nobody, and Snoop Dogg had just sat there, watching, waiting, letting Lucas dig his own grave. The manager, Theo, rushed over, panic written all over his face. Mr. Dogg, I am so sorry about the service tonight. This is completely unacceptable. Your meal is on the house, of course. No, it's not. The words were calm, final. Snoop reached for the check, slid his card across the table again. Charge it. Lucas felt like he was underwater. The air in the restaurant had shifted. Nobody was talking anymore, not really. They were all watching. Snoop leaned back, tilting his head slightly, as if considering something. You know, he said, voice easy, I've been recording this whole time. Lucas's stomach dropped, his mouth went dry. And Snoop? He was still smiling. There was no anger in it, no malice, just pure amusement. I get a lot of fake people in my life, Snoop continued, sliding his phone across the table. The screen was open to a recording app. The timestamp went back to the moment Lucas had walked up to take his order. But you were real. Lucas didn't know what to say. Theo let out a nervous laugh. Well, Mr. Dogg, we'd be happy to make it up to you in any way. Snoop held up a hand. I don't need anything. Then he turned to Lucas. But I do got a question for you. Lucas braced himself. Snoop studied him for a second, like he was weighing something in his head. Then he said it. You ever thought about working for me? The words didn't make sense at first. Lucas almost laughed, waiting for the punchline. But Snoop wasn't joking. What? Lucas said before he could stop himself. You're blunt, Snoop said. You don't sugarcoat. You see through the BS. He tapped the screen of his phone. And apparently, you're not afraid to tell the truth, even when it's a bad idea. Lucas's mind was still spinning. See, I got a whole team of people, Snoop continued. PR reps, media strategists, social guys, all of them get paid to make sure my brand stays looking right, he shrugged. Problem is, they all tell me what I want to hear. The realization started creeping in. You, Snoop said, you ain't afraid to say what you really think. He nodded toward the bar. Marco over there's been pouring drinks for 10 years. Think he's ever told me I'm pronouncing Bordeaux wrong? Silence. Theo, still standing there, looked like he was about to faint. Snoop folded his hands. I got a spot open on my team. Someone to keep it real with me. Give me the truth, even when I don't like it. He glanced back up. Think you can do that? Lucas's brain wasn't processing fast enough. He had walked into this shift thinking it would be like any other. He had expected to leave with a sore back, a couple of crumpled bills and tips, and another reminder that his life wasn't going anywhere. Instead, he was standing in front of Snoop Dogg, getting offered a job. Theo let out a weak chuckle. I'm sure Lucas is flattered, but... Snoop raised a brow. But? Theo swallowed. But, I mean, he's just a waiter. Snoop smiled. Not anymore. The restaurant was dead silent. Lucas hadn't answered yet. He wasn't sure he could answer. All he knew was that his entire life had just changed, and there wasn't a damn thing Theo could do about it. Lucas had spent years perfecting the art of the comeback. He always had something to say, a sharp retort ready to go, a perfectly timed insult wrapped in just enough fake politeness to keep from getting fired. It was his thing, his defense mechanism, his way of making it through shifts that felt like a slow death. But now, standing in front of Snoop Dogg, with half the restaurant holding their breath, waiting for his response, he had nothing. His mind was a tangled mess of every bad decision he'd made in the last 2 hours. Every smug remark, every condescending look, every assumption he'd been so sure of. And now, instead of getting chewed out or fired, he was being offered a job. A job. For a guy he had spent the entire night treating like he didn't belong. Theo, the manager, still looked like he was about to faint. He had already done the math in his head. This wasn't just about losing a customer. This was about who that customer was. A bad review from a celebrity of Snoop's level could bury a place like Brixton Prime. Mr. Dogg, I really think we should... Snoop held up a hand, cutting Theo off like he wasn't even there. He wasn't interested in excuses or apologies. He was still looking at Lucas, waiting. So, Snoop said, voice easy, what's it going to be? Lucas wasn't sure if he was supposed to answer right away. Was this real? Was he actually being asked to? What? Be honest for a living? Say what he really thought? Wasn't that exactly what had gotten him into this mess? Sophia, still standing by the bar, looked like she was about to explode. Marco had gone suspiciously quiet. The execs at the nearby table were already typing something into their phones. Lucas glanced at Theo, who was still frozen, probably running through a dozen ways to salvage the situation. And for the first time all night, Lucas felt like he had the upper hand. On one condition, he said. Snoop's eyebrows lifted slightly. Lucas took a breath. I get to keep telling the truth. No filtering. No fake compliments. No sugarcoating. If you're looking for some yes man to sit around nodding at everything you say, that's not me. For a second, Snoop just stared at him. Then he laughed, a deep, real laugh that cut through the tension hanging over the room. See, Snoop said, shaking his head, this is exactly why I'm hiring you. Lucas wasn't sure if his brain was still working properly. A part of him was screaming that this was insane, that it was a prank, that at any moment someone was going to jump out and tell him he was being punked. But no one did. Snoop reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and slid it across the table. My assistant's number is on there, he said. Be at my office Monday morning, 9 sharp. Lucas hesitated, staring at the card like it might burst into flames. You in or what? Snoop asked. Lucas picked it up. I'm in. A second of silence. Then Sophia let out a sound that was half a laugh, half a shocked breath. Someone at the bar muttered, Holy shit! The execs at the corner table were openly grinning now, already seeing the viral potential of this moment. Snoop leaned back, looking satisfied. Good choice. Theo finally found his voice again. Lucas, can we talk for a second? Lucas turned, and for the first time ever, he saw Theo for what he really was. Just another guy trying to hold on to control. Trying to manage the situation, smooth things over, put everything back where it belonged. Except nothing was going back to the way it was. Lucas had spent years watching people come into this restaurant, pretending to be something they weren't. Tonight, he had spent 2 hours convinced he had someone figured out, only to realize he'd been completely, hilariously wrong. But somehow, that had worked out for him. He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but he was ready to find out. He turned back to Snoop. So, about this job, you need me to start sugarcoating things Monday, or can I tell you your French pronunciation is awful right now? Snoop grinned. Oh, you definitely can, but that don't mean I won't make fun of yours right back. Lucas smirked. Fair enough. The execs at the nearby table clinked their glasses together like they were celebrating a business deal. Someone in the kitchen cheered. Marco shook his head, muttering, Unbelievable. Lucas let it all wash over him. He had walked into this shift thinking it was just another night, just another round of pretending to care, keeping his head down and surviving. Instead, he had talked himself into a new job, one that paid more than he had ever made, one that could actually help his mom, his sister, his entire life. He still wasn't sure how the hell it had happened, but he wasn't about to question it. Theo let out a sharp breath. Lucas, you can't just... Lucas turned to him, feeling lighter than he had in years. Relax, Theo. It's just business. Snoop laughed again. Damn right. Lucas pocketed the card. His shift was over. Monday morning came fast. Lucas had barely processed what had happened before he found himself standing outside a massive glass building, trying to convince himself he wasn't about to walk into a disaster. Snoop Dogg had given him a job. An actual, real job. Not in a kitchen, not carrying trays, not faking smiles for people who saw him as nothing but a background character in their night out. No, he was about to walk into an office full of professionals, all of whom probably had degrees and experience and resumes that didn't involve dodging drunk customers at 2 a.m. It should have felt ridiculous. It did feel ridiculous. But he was here. Lucas stepped inside, found the front desk, gave his name. The receptionist barely looked surprised. Either she was really good at her job, or she was used to random people showing up at Snoop's office. Take the elevator to the 12th floor, she said. They're expecting you. That didn't make him feel better. When the doors opened, the office was exactly what he expected. Modern, expensive, buzzing with energy. People moved quickly, talking into phones, scrolling through tablets, arguing over marketing strategies. It was a different world, one he had never been a part of. Then someone spotted him. A man in a tailored suit, mid-40s, the kind of guy who looked like he had never worked a day outside of an air-conditioned office. He scanned Lucas up and down, barely hiding his skepticism. You must be the new hire, the man said, hesitation clear. Lucas nodded. The man didn't introduce himself. Come with me. Lucas followed, feeling the eyes on him. He could already hear the unspoken questions. Who is this guy? Why is he here? And most importantly, why the hell did Snoop hire him? The man led him into a conference room. Inside, a long glass table stretched across the room, lined with people in sharp suits and designer clothes. The kind of people who probably spent more on their shoes than Lucas had made in the last 3 months combined. And at the head of the table, Snoop Dogg. Snoop looked up from his phone and grinned. "Lucas, my guy. Glad you showed up." Lucas sat down. He felt the tension in the room. The suited guy, who was clearly someone important, maybe a manager, maybe a PR exec, cleared his throat. "Snoop, can I ask? Why exactly is he here?" Snoop leaned back, completely relaxed. "Because I hired him." The guy's smile was tight. "Right? But for what?" Snoop shrugged. "To tell me the truth." Silence. Someone at the table shifted uncomfortably. A woman with perfect hair and an expensive watch spoke next. "We already have people for that." "No," Snoop said. "You got people who tell me what I want to hear." Lucas was starting to get it. This wasn't just about some job. This was a statement. Snoop had just brought in an outsider, someone with zero experience, no corporate polish, no industry connections, and dropped him in the middle of a room full of professionals who had spent years curating exactly how to talk to him. Lucas wasn't supposed to be here. And that was the point. Snoop nodded toward a stack of papers in front of the team. "So what's on the agenda?" The PR guy hesitated before sliding a folder toward him. "We're finalizing the press release for your next project." Lucas glanced down. A neatly typed, carefully crafted, completely sanitized document, the kind of thing designed to sound impressive while saying absolutely nothing. Snoop didn't even pick it up. He just looked at Lucas. "What do you think?" Lucas blinked. "Me? Yeah," Snoop said. "You're here to keep it real, right? So keep it real." Lucas hesitated. He was being tested. Not just by Snoop, but by everyone in the room. They were waiting for him to say something stupid, to prove he didn't belong. He picked up the press release, skimmed it. It was exactly what he expected. Corporate fluff, vague buzzwords, a carefully crafted image. It was fine. It was safe, and it was boring as hell. Lucas put the paper down. "This is garbage." The room stiffened. The PR guy's face turned red. "Excuse me?" Lucas exhaled. "I mean, come on. This sounds like it was written by a robot. It doesn't say anything. It's just a bunch of words stacked on top of each other, trying to sound important. Nobody's going to read this and care." Silence. Then Snoop grinned. "See? This is why he's here." The PR guy looked like he wanted to throw Lucas out the window. "This press release was crafted by a team of professionals." "And none of y'all said what he just did," Snoop cut in. More silence. Snoop turned back to Lucas. "All right, so what would you say?" Lucas hesitated. This was the moment. He could play it safe, backtrack, try to smooth things over. Or he picked up the paper again. "First off, cut half of this. Nobody cares about corporate jargon. Say what you mean. Second, talk like a real person. You don't have to sound like a lawyer to sound smart. And third, actually tell people why they should give a damn." Snoop nodded. "Right? Do it." Lucas frowned. "What?" "Rewrite it." Lucas froze. "Like right now?" Snoop gestured at the laptop in front of him. "You got somewhere to be?" Lucas swallowed. This was insane. He had never written a press release in his life. He had no idea what he was doing, but Snoop was still looking at him, waiting. So Lucas picked up the laptop, and he started typing. The room was dead silent as he worked. People exchanged looks, whispered to each other. The PR guy crossed his arms, seething. Lucas didn't care. When he was done, he pushed the laptop back to Snoop. Snoop read it, nodding slowly. Then he laughed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, still grinning, "that's how you keep it real." The team stayed silent. Snoop slid the laptop to the PR guy. "Make this happen." The guy's eye twitched, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." Lucas sat back, heartbeat still hammering. He had no idea if what he wrote was good, no idea if it would actually go out. But one thing was clear. He had just passed the test. Snoop clapped his hands together. "All right, let's move on." And just like that, Lucas was in. Lucas didn't know what he expected after that meeting, but it wasn't this. The moment they left the conference room, the whispers started. He could feel the weight of the looks, the careful distance people were keeping. He wasn't one of them, and they wanted him to know it. Snoop, on the other hand, acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. He led Lucas down the hall, talking about the next steps like Lucas hadn't just thrown a grenade into his PR team's entire process. "You handled yourself in there," Snoop said. Lucas wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a test. "I just said what I thought." "Exactly." Snoop stopped walking, turned to face him. "You know how rare that is?" Lucas didn't answer. Snoop studied him for a second. "Let me ask you something. Back at that restaurant, why'd you assume I was broke?" Lucas exhaled. "Because I've seen 100 guys walk in dressed like you, trying to be something they're not. They order the expensive stuff, rack up a bill they can't afford, then scramble when it's time to pay. He hesitated. I thought you were one of them. Snoop nodded, like that was the answer he expected. And what's that say about how you see people? Lucas frowned. Snoop gave him a knowing look. You built a whole system in your head. Rich people act one way, broke people act another. You thought you had it all figured out. Lucas let that sit for a moment. He'd spent so much time thinking he could read people that he had them pegged the second they walked in the door. But Snoop wasn't wrong. He had boxed people in, made assumptions, treated them accordingly. And now, he was standing here because of it. Here's the thing, Snoop continued. Most people will want to impress. They want to fit in. They want to be liked. You don't care about that. You say what's real. That's rare. Lucas wasn't sure what to do with that. Snoop checked his phone. All right, I got to bounce, but you? He nodded toward an office down the hall. You got work to do. Lucas blinked. Work? Yeah, you ain't here to sit around, are you? Lucas followed his gaze to the office door, his name already on a plaque outside. The job was real. The paycheck was real. The life change? That was real too. Snoop grinned. Don't get comfortable though. First time you start acting like everybody else in here, you're out. Lucas smirked. Guess I better stay annoying. Damn right, Snoop said, and with that, he walked off. Lucas stepped into his new office. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, but it was his. A laptop sat on the desk, a few files stacked neatly next to it. He sat down, took a breath, and opened the first email. Subject, your first project. It was from Snoop's team, outlining everything he needed to get up to speed on. Brand messaging, campaign goals, media perception. Lucas skimmed through it, then opened a blank document. He was still figuring out what this job meant, what his role actually was. But one thing was clear. He wasn't here to fit in. He was here to tell the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A week later, Lucas was sitting in a boardroom again, this time in front of a room full of people who had spent years building their careers in PR and media. All right, one of the execs said, clicking to the next slide on the presentation. We need to finalize the messaging on this campaign. Any thoughts? Lucas looked down at the polished, pre-approved statement on the screen. It was safe, generic, nothing that would make anyone actually care. He raised a hand. The room fell silent. Snoop, sitting at the end of the table, leaned forward slightly, waiting. Lucas glanced around at the team, the same people who had dismissed him a week ago. Then he looked back at the screen. Yeah, he said. I got something. The news broke that afternoon. Snoop Dogg hires waiter who insulted him, and it might be his smartest move yet. The article detailed the entire night at Brixton Prime, the way Lucas had misjudged him, the way Snoop had flipped the whole situation into something unexpected. It framed the story as a lesson in humility, in opportunity, in the way honesty, brutal, unfiltered, sometimes misguided, could open doors no one saw coming. Lucas saw his name trending. He saw old coworkers from the restaurant posting about him. He saw comments from people arguing over whether he deserved the job, whether Snoop was crazy, whether this was the best or worst hiring decision of the year. He closed his laptop, let it all sink in. Then he grabbed his phone and dialed. Lucas? His mother's voice came through, tired but warm. Yeah, Ma. You okay? He exhaled. Yeah, I'm good. A pause. Then softly, I saw the news. Lucas smiled. Yeah? You always had a smart mouth, she said. Guess it finally paid off. Lucas laughed, shaking his head. Guess so. She hesitated. Does this mean you don't have to worry about the bills anymore, Ma? Lucas said. And Maria? She's finishing school. Whatever she needs, it's covered. Silence on the other end. Then the sound of his mother exhaling like she had been carrying a weight for years and was finally setting it down. I'm proud of you, baby. Lucas swallowed. Thanks, Ma? He hung up, staring at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down. There were still a lot of things he didn't know. He didn't know how long this job would last. He didn't know if he was about to crash and burn or if he'd actually make something of it. He didn't know if he really belonged in a world like this. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was living. And that was enough. Thank you for being here and for taking the time to experience this story. Some stories stick with us, not because they're perfect, but because they remind us of something real, of unexpected chances, of people proving us wrong, of the fact that sometimes the best opportunities come from the most unlikely places. I appreciate you being a part of this journey. Stay curious, stay open minded, and most importantly, keep looking for the stories that challenge the way you see the world.